Hey guys, Alicia here, and today we are going to be talking about some difficult topics. If COVID-19 wasn't a more difficult enough challenge for us to try to overcome here in the United States and all across the world, we are now being kind of plagued by the aftermath of George Floyd's death. It is an incredibly sad and truly horrifying situation, and we are now seeing all across the United States people standing up and deciding that this is enough. Enough minorities and enough black people have now died in this last month and kind of during this entire year and kind of beyond that for people to truly come up and be disgusted. We are seeing protest after protest. We are seeing an incredible amount of people come out of their homes and start fighting for something they believe in. We also are seeing a lot of looting and a lot of rioting happening all across the United States, whether that is being kind of sparked by radical groups such as Antifa or white supremacy groups trying to cast a shadow upon protesting groups. We are seeing a lot of chaos and pandemonium. We are also seeing a lot of people come out for the first time saying that they're not going to just allow these things to continue happening. They're starting to come out and say that enough is enough. We as a people need to elevate ourselves to a higher standard of living, and we as a people need to start truly working on the concept of racism. We need to get away from racism. The United States has always had a difficult relationship with the concept of racism, and it's a very serious topic to consider. Kind of going back all the way back to the founding of our country and throughout kind of coming up to the Civil War and kind of even beyond that, we have always struggled with the concept of racism. We've always struggled with the concept of thinking one race is better than another, and because of that, it's okay to subject the other race to your power and authority, taking away their rights and freedoms, really simply in an effort to consolidate your own power and make it clear that you are the most powerful person around. As far as I'm concerned, it's utterly disgusting. And as an American, it's probably one of the things I'm the most ashamed of, my history and our past as a nation. It's very difficult as a student to kind of come up into the world and read about how racism has plagued our country. Listen over and over again about how, as a nation, we allowed slavery to get itself rooted within the foundation of our country, and then how once that started kind of piling over, and once that became too much, we broke out into a war to a degree. Well, we did break into a war, but I guess when I say to a degree, I'm kind of talking about whether or not what all that entailed. Slavery was a very big issue in our country. It's always been a big issue of our past. And kind of looking back on the Civil War, when I say to a degree, I'm kind of talking about the fact that it seemed as though it really never was about slavery to an extent. It kind of seemed like the North did not like that the South had wealth. They did not like that through slaves they were able to acquire wealth and become more powerful than they were in the North. That was largely about industry. And when kind of saying to a degree, what I mean is, personally, I tend to think that the Civil War sparked upon a complex for power. If you kind of look back at history, and even with Abraham Lincoln, it really wasn't about doing what's right by minority groups or slaves or black people. It was really just about consolidating more power. Now, I don't want to get too far into that because that's an entire different topic for another time, and I'm not really prepared to talk about that. Though, looking through our history, we've always struggled with that. Even after the Civil War, after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, all giving rights to black people. The 13th giving them freedom, though having the stipulation that if they are arrested, that they can be put into slavery. The 14th doing away with the concept of the 13th, actually making them free, because after the 13th, there was a lot of fake laws being put in place. Well, not fake laws, but oppressive laws being put in place simply to arrest black people and have black people be sentenced to jail where they could be slaves. The 14th Amendment worked to fix that, and the 15th Amendment, to my knowledge, if I'm correct, gave African Americans, black people, the right to vote. And even after the 15th Amendment, we see a lot of issue coming into the early 1900s and coming into the 1950s and so on with civil rights activism, where in many places across America, minority groups, specifically black people, were oppressed to the degree where they weren't even allowed to exercise rights that they were given by our own Constitution and by our own country. As far as I'm concerned, it's incredibly disgusting to see these things in our history. It really saddens me as a person, kind of looking back at history and seeing situations like Emmett Till's, where coming to the South from after living in the North, was apprehended and beaten and tortured to death by white Southerners simply for interacting with a white woman, is incredibly disgusting. I personally am not a racist person, and I am truly revolted by the concept of racism. I am all for equality, and coming from the psychological standpoint and the psychological aspect of it all, it's very difficult to look at the topic of racism. At the end of the day, racism boils down to an emotional kind of status. The concept of allowing our emotions to push us to the edge, to a point really where we feel the need to dominate over other life. That from an emotional standpoint, we need to consolidate and feel good about ourselves to the point where we need to say that we are better than other people simply for something that we can't even control. That somehow me being white or someone else being black makes it okay for there to be any kind of a judgment. It's so sad to think about this concept. It's so sad as a person, as a student, kind of coming in and being raised into into 2020, that I can look at history and I can see all the disgusting horror that has filled our nation when it comes to racism, and still see today that we have racial oppression all across of our country. And even after, so this George Floyd being murdered by Derek Chauvin, I think I might have butchered his last name, to see that alone didn't just stop everybody to be in shock. This is the third black people that has been killed within the last month, as far as I understand. You first have Ahmaud Arbery, then you have the situation, I forget her name, where she was killed during a failed / misconstructed drugs bust where they came to the wrong house. And now with George Floyd, and now even after this, even after people have really come out and started protesting, we still aren't seeing peace finally struck out. I mean, if you look at the news today, you see a lot that whether it's anti-protesters using force / killing protesters, or police using unnecessary force. If I'm right, again, a lot of this is just based off news articles that I've been reading lately. There are 6 officers that are currently being charged for using excessive force against the protester. We also can see that I want to say that there are 2 officers being that have charges against them in San Francisco for using excessive force against a protester. I think a protester just died in San Francisco. It's shuddering. It really kind of disgusts me, and it really saddens me to see all of this. A man is dead. Multiple people are dead. All kind of based around this emotional need and this emotional reaction to the concept of power and dominance. It's terrible. It's terrible to see that even after George Floyd's death, we are still seeing police brutality. It's terrible that even after this man's death, after he's been killed, that our own president is using excessive force on peaceful protesters to go out and be able to have a photo op in front of a church. Now, I'm not really coming out against the president through a kind of wider scope. I'm not really here to tell you what to believe. I'm not really here to tell you that our president is bad, or Republicans are bad, or Democrats are good or bad. I'm just here to kind of lay out and kind of talk about what's happening. At the end of the day, like or dislike our current president, what he did within the situation, lashing out against peaceful protesters, is wrong. It's terribly wrong, and it's terribly sad to see happen. And kind of coming back to the main point of the video to talk about how where the psychology of it all comes in, it's I have to say, it is both interesting and terribly horrifying to see where psychology comes into it. As far as I understand, and as far as I'm concerned, emotions really, although incredibly good and bring so much life and color into this world today, they push us as a people to make some really horrific decisions, and they push us to almost really constantly oppressing people who are different than us. It's very sad. We see today with many different movements. We have the Black Lives Matter movement, the All Lives Matter movement, the Blue Lives Matter movement. We see that these are all people who are reacting to a situation extremely. Now, I want to kind of clarify. I'm not necessarily pointing the blame at someone. I'm not saying Black Lives Matter is overly radical in a wrong way. I'm not saying Blue Lives Matter is over radical in one way. And I'm not saying All Lives Matter is overly radical in one way. Obviously, I have an opinion on the matter, but I want to kind of keep this quote-unquote civil, and the fact that I don't want to be condemning. I don't want people to feel as though I'm condemning them. I don't know that I, as a person with my own emotional biases and my own emotional kind of transgressions, that I can really condemn anyone. We might kind of talk about politics in the future, in that kind of where my own stances are and what I'm thinking on the matter. But at the end of the day, we see that we have these radical groups. And again, I'm not necessarily using radical in a bad way. I'm just talking about they're looking at the situation and they are reacting in some form of an extreme manner, whether it's widespread protesting or I don't want to include rioting because we're only starting to see that now, but I'm going to stick with protesting, with widespread protesting. We see that for whatever reason that people see these quote-unquote radical movements, and it sparks an emotion within them. It seems like people get indignant, and that leads them to starting counter-protests. I mean, it seems like as far as the racial issue in the United States, after Black Lives Matter was established, this quote-unquote radical group that was established, that was doing widespread protests across the country, advocating for racial rights and minority rights, we kind of come in and see that as a result to seeing this, people became indignant and really started these counter-protests simply from an emotional response they had to seeing a protest about anti-violence. Now, to me, I find this a little bit startling. I don't quite understand how you can take a protest for the protection of life and then kind of manipulate it into thinking that somehow it's against the problem, and somehow that you then need to create counter protests to quote unquote include more people. I'm not entirely sure why this is necessary, but at the end of the day, we can see that people, for whatever reason, react to an extremely, and that at the end of the day, that what we have now between all these different quote-unquote radical groups, that they're compounding each other's extremity, making each other more extreme. Now, I'm not saying that a voice needs to be made. I'm not saying that, that a voice doesn't need to be made. I'm not saying that people do not need to come out. They do. The only way we're going to get anywhere with these situations is by putting our differences aside and uniting together as Americans, as people who are alive in this country, who are contributing to the essence of what makes America America, and realize that we are all in this together and we are all equals in this together. That's something that we don't see a lot of. We see extreme/radical groups come in with their, not necessarily demands, but with their stances, their highly opinionated stances, and they just try to battle it out with these other groups. And as far as I understand, even looking at the political spectrum within the United States, looking back to past presidential elections. So lately I've been watching past debates and past political campaigns, and I've noticed that looking back to the political climate of the United States in 2008 and 2012, we noticed that the way people reacted with each other, the way that different political candidates and political parties interacted with each other, is very different than how they act today in 2020 and also in 2016. 2016 is where we really started to see this sense of radicalism in political ideology. Back in 2008 and 2012, you had people who had very different opinions. I'm going to kind of explain this through talking about John McCain and Barack Obama, and then again, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney in 2012. We see that these are people who have very different opinions. Mitt Romney and John McCain have very different opinions from Barack Obama. Yet, at the same time, we see this sense of diplomacy between these candidates. They aren't necessarily attacking each other at their own foundations, though we see this a little bit. They are attacking various beliefs and ideologies. They're not attacking the person, they're kind of attacking the establishment with which that person abides to or subscribes to. Now in 2020 but back in 2016, we see that people kind of were pushed to this extreme where you have two extremes clashing at it bitterly. At the end of the day, we are the United States of America. We are meant to be kind of a correlating body of various states that are united as one, united as a single country. Yet at the same time, the South is not the North. One state is not another state. Black people are not white people. And now we have all of these different kind of emotions that are coming out and all of these extreme reactions to these situations that are just crippling us as a nation. I personally do not quite understand the urge to want to be racist. I can't understand it. I do understand to a degree what sparks it. So I don't know what it is to be racist. I don't know why someone is driven to be racist. Yet I kind of understand that at the end of the day, you have people who are emotionally frustrated. You have white people who feel that after the Civil War and as minority groups started to quote-unquote gain power, and as these groups began to become, as far as I'm concerned, seen as humans, they all of a sudden got defensive and felt as though that their liberties and the life that they knew and loved was being taken away from them, and that somehow they were being done wrong against, and their response to this was to not just stop racism, but to expand it to the point of using the government and using police agencies and such as a tool to continue the spread of racism. How we see in the 1950s and on, during a lot of civil rights movements, how we see that police agencies were using excessive violence is really not the right term, because that I would say is pretty moot, or not moot, but is pretty pretty conservative in the spectrum. But using excessive violence against people simply for wanting to be considered as people and wanting to have the right to vote is sickening. I don't necessarily understand why people got caught up with this emotional sense of domination. I don't understand why we cannot just see each other as equals. I don't understand that. I do understand that within this concept, or within this racial structure, that people do like to be different to an extent. A lot of black people like to have the concept of black culture. A lot of white people like the concept of white culture, and so on. It kind of continues on from that. We all like to have our own sense of culture. And I guess to a degree we can see that these cultures clash. White people disrespect black people for black people culture, and that just manifests into an entire mess of animosity. I don't quite understand that, but I think that there is an incredibly serious issue with it. Now, I see that this video is getting quite long. This is by far the longest video I've ever made. And I don't necessarily know that I'm able to talk about all the things that I want to talk about, but if I want to leave you, the viewer, with anything, it's that I think even though racism is a problem, even though people who are racists are the problem, and as a result people are dying, we need to kind of realize and remember the fact that we are all human. We are all plagued with the same concept of emotion. We all respond to things in very similar manners, although there's plenty of variation within that. Yet at the same time, although these actions are not unacceptable, I think we can understand where they, to a degree, stem from. It's difficult when you are being oppressed to say, I'm going to consider the person who's oppressing me. And I'm not necessarily saying that I'm not necessarily condemning protesters and saying that, oh, shame on you, you're not considering the person who's oppressing you. Obviously, that's ridiculous. But I want to kind of point it out to the quote-unquote oppressors. At the end of the day, your response to this situation is likely emotionally based. And this really stems back to my first video about emotional decision-making, and even my second video about rationality. At the end of the day, for whatever reason, people tend to forget the concept of irrationality and forget that they make decisions emotionally. It's a huge problem. And kind of speaking to the oppressors, speaking to the racist people, I think to you, it's important to realize that no one is trying to take away your sense of being white. No one is trying to take away your culture. We see this a lot with religion, and I want to talk about that in a later video, but no one is coming at you to take away your rights and freedoms. You're really just being asked, I guess I can say, just to be a decent person. I mean, obviously, if you're someone who's making decisions emotionally, you're already assuming that you're a reasonable person, and me saying that you just need to be a decent person is kind of attacking you as being a non-decent person. It's very interesting to consider human psychology. We have a lot of issues with terminology. We have a lot of issues with how various words make us think and act in a certain way. It's something I enjoy considering, but we see that there is a very negative and nasty side to all of this. We see this currently happening today. So to you, the people who struggle with the concept of acceptance, with allowing others to be considered the same as yourself, one, no one is trying to take away your freedoms to be who you are. We're simply asking you to allow other people to be as free as you are and consider them equal to yourself. I think that is a very basic thing to expect from people, yet we're seeing that we still struggle with this as a people. The next thing is that, honestly, violence is never the right answer or the solution to anything. Even if you struggle to be ethnically accepting, turning to violence is the wrong way. If you think it's an issue and you think it's a problem, keep that to yourself. You're not helping anyone by lashing out on people who are different than you are. It builds to the problem. And we see that happening today. The next thing I would like to talk to people who are part of these protests, who are saying, who are screaming out and saying that, kind of coming out with their own radicalized sense of right. I agree with your cause. Personally, and I'm going to kind of continue with that. Personally, I think that it is a no-brainer for everyone to be able to feel safe in their country, for everyone to feel represented by the police, for everyone to feel that they are treated equal. I think that it's a no-brainer, and it's sad that that's not the case. I think as a people, instead of protesting, I think one of the better things would be for us to collaborate and come together. This isn't about a black problem or a white problem. This is really about a people problem. We need to realize that this living life isn't really worth anything if all we're going to do is keep other people from enjoying the life that they have. We're all only given the one life here. We're able to, and honestly, we're called to just be decent people to one another. I understand the cause, and I'm personally for it. Actually, I was just at a protest today. Though what I tend to notice is that these protesters who, as far as I'm considered, are protesting a just cause, they tend to get emotional their own selves. And I'm not saying that that's that you're wrong to get emotional. I think you're incredibly justified given the situation. But I would like to remind you of the Civil Rights Acts during the 1950s and onward. Martin Luther King Jr. is not considered to be the man he is today, and was not able to achieve what he did in the past by being this emotionally charged people who was lashing out. His entire movement was based on the concept of peace, based on the concept of not lashing out on another person, but simply seeking out an equality. It's easy to say now that, well, it's great and all that he did that, but we're not seeing that happen today. At the end of the day, what Martin Luther King Jr. did, the movement he sparked and the people he inspired led to some of the greatest social and racial changes we have ever seen in this country. It is a terrible shame that he was killed, but honestly, he wasn't killed because he was seen as a radical. Honestly, as far as I'm concerned, he was killed because people were scared of how reasonable he was. They were scared of how he was able to keep his emotions aside and truly fight for something he believed in. He fought desperately for this sense of equality. He fought desperately to create a world where his children could play with any children they want, and they didn't have to fear some kind of oppression as a result of it. He didn't do this by screaming. He didn't do this by chanting out "F the police." He did not do that. He did not do that by harming anyone else. He did not do that by calling people to arms and calling to great radicalization. He did that through the use of peace. The protests I was at today, they were actually very good at keeping the consideration of peace. Yet at the same time, there were different parts within where I could see that the emotion crept in, and it became less about promoting and showing what needs to happen and showing what needs to change, and more about lashing out at the system of oppression. I understand the feeling inside to lash out to oppression around us. I do understand that, but I think if we want to get through this issue, if we want to get through this situation today, we need to start considering peace again. We need to start realizing that we are all people. The racist people are people. They're acting emotionally. The civil rights activists are people. They are acting emotionally. I think that at the end of the day, extremes are only going to multiply extremes. Black Lives Matter is only going to magnify the reaction of Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. It's not to say that Black Lives Matter isn't right in what they're doing, and it's not to say that their cause is not just. It's to say that if we want to get through this, I personally think that we need to stop making this about an emotional reaction to the oppression and start making it about how are we going to stand together to get away from this? How are we going to stand united as one to elevate ourselves to a new standard of living? And I think it's something that Martin Luther King Jr. did very, very well. At the protest I was at today, there was one of the speakers said some interesting things. And I understand that this video is getting to be very long. I want to be able to get my different points out that I would like to talk about. And what he said was that this is a time not to necessarily lash out and act emotionally, not to turn to rioting. He said that he understands the rioting, though he does not think rioting is the right course of action right now. He said that now is a time to consider the situation. It's a time to strategize, to consider the solution, and put into act a way to achieve that solution. This isn't necessarily about the here and now in this particular moment. This is about changing the way we as a people are to elevate ourselves to a higher standard of living for the future. That's what this is about today. And I was so inspired by what he had to say in that moment. He also kind of went off to say that right now is not a time to be silent. Now, there's a difference between screaming and speaking. There's a difference between lashing out at the establishment around and saying F the police, F the government, F all of this. It's easy to say those things. But at the end of the day, our reaction should be more about how are we going to about what is wrong in this situation and how we're going to get out of it. He was saying that for him, he kind of struggled a little bit with the idea of coming out and speaking. He was a little bit worried. But he realized that if he did not speak, he was allowing the system of oppression to continue, and he was choosing to do nothing about it. And through doing that, he was no better than the people who were subjecting others to an oppressive situation. I respect that, and I think that is exactly where we as a people need to be moving towards in the future. Now, I realize this video is going on for far too long, and I would like to thank any of you who have continued and actually have listened to all of this. I think it probably is much better to listen to more as a podcast than actually as a video right now, because obviously you're not seeing me do too much other than speaking. I want to thank you all for watching, and I just want to say generally to everyone out there who is watching, stay safe during this time. It is a very stressful time. It is a very scary time, but I think that as a people, we can unite and we can get through this. We're not going to be able to do this alone. We're going to need to stand together, but I hope that there is a time where we all are able to stand together regardless of the differences that potentially divide us. That's truly what I would like to see in the future. Anyways, guys, thank you for watching today's episode of Political Outline. Stay safe out there and have a good one.